Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Spark, the email client from Riedel. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Vitici. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
Good. You know what? It's time for another special guest on App Stories.
A very special one.
A very special one. And I want to dive right in because we want to maximize the time with our guest, but a little introduction is in order first. Today we have with us none other than James Thomson, the developer of PCalc, the app that I recently called Delightfully Insane. And I meant that in only the best possible way, James, which we'll get to in a bit, I think.
I take it as a compliment.
Okay, good. I'm a big fan of PCalc, and I know Federico uses it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the app and about your perspective on the App Store and running an indie business. So welcome to the show, James.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
So, James, I really want to start by congratulating you on your 25th anniversary. That's a big milestone. I mean, there aren't too many people who can say that they've had an app that's in continuous development for 25 years.
Yeah, I think it's just me and Rich Siegel.
I think you're probably right. You started that app before you did a stint at Apple, and I wanted to ask you, what was it that made you make the leap from kind of doing that as, I think it was originally shareware, to going to Apple but then deciding to go off and start your own independent business?
Well, it was mostly an accident, really. I wrote PCalc in 92 and DragThing in 94, and they were just to learn how to write code and also genuinely to try and get me noticed by Apple. Both were free at first, and I was happy for people just to use them and give me feedback and the occasional postcard and things like that. I was a student living at home, so I didn't really think about doing it for the money at that point. The first time I actually sold anything was DragThing in 1997, so gosh, 21 years ago, while I was actually working at Apple. And I had switched it to being shareware rather than freeware because I had a friend who had a small utility app that made him, a couple of $1,000s a year. And it was enough to keep him in new laptops and development tools and things like that. So I thought, well, I want some of this as well. As an indication of how many sales I expected, I released the new version and immediately went on holiday with no connection to the internet. These were different times. It sounds somewhat impossible now. But I didn't check my mail until about a week later. And based on the initial sales over that week, it was immediately clear to me that I needed to create a company there and then. I mean, what really made me take the leap from working at Apple to starting my own company was my boss at Apple telling me I needed to move to California or else I'd effectively be fired. But that's kind of another story.
Apple wasn't really at the pinnacle as it is today in the late 90s. What was it like leaving a corporate job like that to write your own software and try to make a go of it?
It was actually great. It was way better than it is today. Pretty much a golden age of shareware. Apple might have been in trouble at that point, in the sort of 97, around then. But that didn't really filter down into my world when I was writing software and things. People would very happily pay you sums of money for software. And it was a much smaller pond, so you could be a bigger fish more easily. And I think because Apple and Apple users were the underdog, there was some kind of shared camaraderie about it all. It seemed more fun. It felt a lot easier. People seemed less cynical. Maybe it's just because I was young and innocent back then.
So how did the transition from Mac to iPhone happen? I don't remember if you were on the App Store on day one, but I have to assume that you were pretty early to the iPhone App Store.
It was indeed there on day
Perfect.
one.
Of course you were.
It's somewhat of a habit. There was like 400 apps, I think, on that day. So, we kind of knew each other at that point.
Sure.
I had used PCalc many times over my career as a short thing, as a small app that I could easily port and experiment with. So like when I was first doing stuff for Mac OS X, I ported and rewrote bits of the app to make a Mac OS X version. So when iOS came out, it was a similar deal. It was something that I figured, well, here's a small thing. I'll write it. I'll get to know how to do stuff on iOS, and then I'll move on and I'll write my real big app for iOS. And, nearly 10 years later, I'm still writing it. But yeah, that seems to be what always happens. It was quite a big success from day one on iOS, so I've just kind of rolled with it.
There was a line in your blog post about the 25th anniversary that stood out to me, and I wanted to ask you because I couldn't believe it. You said that there's code in PCalc that dates back to 25 years ago. Is that really true? Is that like actual code that you wrote over 20 years ago? Okay.
It's absolutely true. I mean, there's a slight glossing over detail because the original code was written in Pascal, and I hand translated that Pascal into C. But from that point on, that C code, which, is still 20 something years old, it is still, bits of it are still running. There's routine names, because I was looking at the old code recently. There are some routine names and variable names and things which are exactly the same as 25 years ago. It's like there's this central core, and then around it there's all these layers. But if you dig right deep into the middle, there's some of that code. And yeah, I wish I'd written it better 25 years ago.
Wow. So do you keep around all these versions, like from the very first source code up until the latest iPhone update?
I was doing a talk for UL a few years back, and I went back and I'd recovered all my floppy disks, like sort of 25-year-old floppy disks, and got code and early prototypes and stuff off that. And I built virtual machines for sort of System 7, macOS 9, and like sort of key points, and then found the developer tools for that time. So I can build all the old versions still from source and run them.
Wow.
So if I need to fix a bug in like the System 7 version for, Mac Classic era, I can do that.
For when you get a bug report from somebody who's still running one of those machines, right?
Oh, you would be surprised. Because there was a version of PCalc that got bundled by Apple with Macs. This was some time after I left. So there was like, I don't know if I'm allowed to say a number, but let's say there was a very large number of copies that were out there. At one point, and I get people still saying, this version has stopped running, and I'm like, well, I'm surprised it was still running.
Yeah, no, I remember when Apple used to do that, and it's just doesn't, like, looking at it from the perspective of today, you would never expect that Apple would bundle software with their computers, but I know Omni had some apps on Apple machines, and so did others.
This was for the original Angle Poise iMac that it was bundled, and it was bundled for about a year.
There's a point in the history of PCalc, a more modern history of PCalc that I wanted to ask you. It was 4 years ago, almost in 2014, back in the days of iOS 8, I think. You updated PCalc with a widget for iOS 8, and I remember seeing your name in a bunch of different websites, including Mac Stories, because we reported on the news that you got in trouble for making this interactive widget that allowed users to make operations and calculations directly from Notification Center, basically. Almost 4 years later, what's the story there? What happened there? Because initially I thought Apple is upset that James made a widget that is interactive, but then it was okay, and it was kind of a strange story from the outside. So what can you tell us about that strange event?
Oh, I think that was certainly one of my more high-profile moments. I mean, the basic idea was, Apple introduced the ability to make these notification center widgets for both iOS and macOS. And they made a calculator widget for macOS and showed it off at WWDC. And I thought, oh, cool. Well, that's clearly an allowed use case. So it seems obvious to me I'll make one for iOS too, because they weren't doing one. And it was approved by Apple. Then it was featured on the store in the widget section, as a shining example of a widget for iOS 8. People seemed to really like it. It was doing quite well. And I got an email a couple of weeks later saying Apple is going to call you at this time. And I thought, that doesn't sound good. And I got a call saying that the widget had been retroactively unapproved, and I had something like a month to remove the widget from PCalc, or PCalc would be removed from the store. And they said widgets cannot perform calculations was the ruling that they said, which was obviously quite silly. And I was told the decision was made quite high up. And while I could technically appeal, the answer wasn't going to change. So, I should set my expectations appropriately. So I was kind of upset about that. So I tweeted out about it, and those tweets got quite a lot of traction from people because, the people like yourselves reported on it. And there was a ton of press coverage, and it made some newspapers and things as well. And within like 48 hours or something, Apple ultimately reversed the decision, said, there's no problem at all. But the first that I heard about it having been reversed was from a journalist at the Guardian newspaper in the UK who had been briefed by Apple PR in the States to tell them that they had changed their mind on it. So that was very interesting. It was a very stressful time. And I mean, it was only the widget, but I'd put in quite a bit of work on it. So, I was quite upset that it was going to be taken away and that I was going to have to deal with all the customers and tell them why it had gone. But yeah, so it got a lot of press. It did very, very well for sales, which bought me a Retina iMac and a holiday in the sun afterwards to recover. But yeah, it was very stressful, and I wouldn't really wish that on anybody. And I like to think that I opened the door a little bit for other people to do slightly more interesting stuff in Notification Center.
Yeah, it seemed like one of those things where Apple was probably of two minds internally on widgets, because if I remember right, even after you were told to pull it, it was still being promoted on the App Store, wasn't it? In the widgets section.
Yeah, I mean, I think Apple is not like one person. Apple is a group of multiple people. And, engineering might come up with these features and these APIs and be over the moon that people are actually using them and adopting them. But, marketing might have different opinions and so on. I don't know whose mind was changed. I'm assuming it was Phil Schiller. If so, thank you, Phil. Mm-hmm. And I hope that they, still don't hold a grudge against me. Whenever you start a stink like that and Apple has to change their mind, you think, there must be a book somewhere that your name goes in.
It feels to me like after that point, you sort of gained a bit of a reputation for pushing the boundaries on some of Apple's APIs. I mean, you put PCalc on the Apple TV, for instance, and now you've been doing crazy stuff with ARKit and SceneKit. Can you kind of talk to me a little bit about what that's all about and why you take a calculator app in these different directions?
Well, I do have a reputation to maintain of being there on day one of pretty much any new Apple technology. People are still getting on to me that I didn't have a iMessage plugin. But I mean, I think at a very basic level, it makes people aware of PCalc and me, but equally important, it keeps my skills fresh and gives me something, new to do. And I like the challenge of doing something. Like, I mean, the TV, for example, is quite silly. There's not really a need for a calculator on your television, but it is a good way to learn how to do it. And I experimented with user interfaces using a game controller, so if you use the joystick on a game controller, you get a different interface. Mm-hmm. And I think like with the ARKit stuff, I knew I wanted to play with ARKit because that was Apple's big thing this past year. And I didn't have any 3D graphics experience at all, really, since university 25 odd years ago. So I taught myself in public and kind of tweeted out videos and things through the summer as I was messing around with stuff. And I let the beta testers play with it as well. And, I learned a lot, and hopefully it was vaguely entertaining for the people who are following along at home. The about screen stuff is not really useful in the calculator, but it keeps my brain learning things. And I'm set for any future Apple AR glasses that come out. And, along the way, there was like the game that appeared in there too, which kind of satisfied the teenage me who got into computers entirely because he wanted to write games. Not a good game, but it is a game. I mean, even like the tip jar and icon picking code, I did all that in Swift to kind of learn that language because I'm a sort of Objective-C dinosaur. Well, really, I'm a C dinosaur. Even if you're doing something silly like that, you're still learning. I mean, it doesn't necessarily make money. I mean, like PCalc on the Apple TV last year didn't even pay for the Apple TV 4K I bought. I made it free as part of the 25th anniversary. because really its purpose now is so that I can play with my About Screen game on a TV with a game controller.
Yeah, I don't think that you're alone in not necessarily making a lot of money off TV apps. I think that the Apple TV ecosystem has been a little bit of a disappointment to a lot of people, especially if for, I think, Apple TV only games or apps.
Yeah. And I'm not sure about the Apple Watch as well. I mean, Federico talked before about having used the Apple Watch PCalc.
Yes.
And, I do still get people who say, oh, I find it really useful. Can you add these features or whatever? So people are using it, but I don't know how much is driving actual sales to adopt this stuff. I mean, I think if I can get PCalc anywhere, I'll do it just for the sake of doing it. And if a certain percentage of people find that useful, then that's cool.
Yeah, if nothing else, I think it helps keep your name in front of people. And I mean, I actually used the Watch app just the other day. I don't even remember for what, but I think my phone was upstairs and I was sitting down here and I was doing a quick calculation and I just tapped it out on my watch.
Yeah, the About Screen's on the Watch as well.
Yeah, I know. It's great. It's amazing that it's on there. Thanks to Spark by Riedel for sponsoring App Stories this week. Spark is smart. Its smarts start with the inbox, where it surfaces the most important email messages and cleans up the rest. New emails are smartly categorized into personal, notifications, and newsletters. Powerful natural language search lets you find exactly what you're looking for. Just search the way you think and let Spark do the rest. Smart notifications filter out the noise too, letting you know when an email message is important and filtering out the rest. Spark calendar invitations are beautiful cards that can be accepted in a single tap. See if you want to accept without even leaving Spark. You can also schedule emails to be sent later and set up follow-up reminders when you don't receive a reply. Quick replies are a great way to get your point across in a single tap, loving, liking, or acknowledging the receipt of an email. Spark looks great too. That terrible forward and quote mess that you see in your inbox sometimes is replaced by a beautiful threaded conversation view. Spark is all about customization. You decide what swipes do what cards are shown, and how many emails you want to see. You can even customize folders of your most important emails by placing them in the sidebar and customizing their color. Snooze an email and get back to it when the time is right. Snoozing works on all of your Apple devices. Spark is also about integrations. Spark supports Dropbox, Box, iCloud Drive, and more. Soon you'll be able to enjoy Spark 2.0, Email for Teams. Spark for Teams is coming soon, and it's going to change the way teams collaborate on email with the ability to do things like comment and discuss messages and write messages together. Thanks again to Spark by Riedel for supporting the show.
There's a question that I always think about. How do you still innovate in a calculator? Which now I don't use the scientific parts of PCalc. I'm not an engineer. I don't do any complex calculations. But it seems to me that the field of mathematics and calculators is pretty much set. So anything you need to do around that needs to be not about the numbers and the operations themselves, but more about the interaction and the design. At least that's my assumption. So how do you still make changes to PCalc after all these years?
Well, I mean, you're right. A lot of the sort of interesting stuff for me comes out of doing user interface. That was always kind of my passion at university, was coming up with interesting user interfaces. So things like, where you can edit the layouts.
Yeah.
That's a useful thing for people to be able to do, but it was also kind of fun to do as a just like, how would I go about doing this? I mean, I've got like a wish list of new features that's a mile long. Ideas aren't really the problem. There's always people that will email you and say, oh, can you make it do this? Can you add support for this? Or this stuff sucks. And I go, I know, that's because I wrote it 25 years ago and I'm meaning to get around to changing it, but I haven't yet. And to a certain extent, it's time and motivation and finding the right creative spark to tackle a problem. It's quite easy to burn out doing something for the entire year. usually the busy period for me is like between WWDC and the phone and OS releases around September, November. Then at the start of the year, I try and do something different. And yeah, I'm currently open to ideas.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, James, is your perspective on the App Store, because you've sold PCalc in just about every possible way you could, whether it's you've distributed it for free on FTP servers or on floppy disks or bundled with Apple hardware. And now, you're on the App Store, both on the Mac and the iOS app stores. What's the kind of the history of that been like? I mean, how do you feel about the App Store today compared to what it was like trying to sell software maybe, 20, 15 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think like 20 odd years ago, it was really easy. As I was saying, it was a kind of golden age. It was, you'd put something up and you'd say, this is $20 and people would pay it. And then it there was a bit of a slump after that. But regarding the App Store, personally, it's been very good to me. As I said, PCalc was one of the first 400 apps on the store. And, on day one, we were $10. And I've managed to keep the price the same for 10 years. Overall, sales are still trending upwards. I don't think PCalc would exist today in this form without the store making it much easier for people to buy apps and to reduce the friction between them buying an app. Overall, I don't know if it's done the software business itself much good. Prices are being driven down. The perceived value of software has never been lower. But, maybe that would have happened anyway, with or without the App Store. I don't know the answer to that, because most other forms of media are suffering badly these days as well. Music, films, news sites, whatever. It's the internet has kind of destroyed the value of a lot of things. So it's hard to lay that completely on the App Store, even though my kind of gut feeling is that it did. But it's hard to separate the two.
Yeah, it is hard to separate them. And still in the last few years, or last maybe year and a half, we've started to see Apple experimenting with more kinds of business models, subscriptions and that sort of thing. But one of the things that always concerns me is for apps like yours, which are more like utility apps, because I don't think subscriptions fit particularly well for something like a calculator or I don't know. There are a lot of little utility apps that someone might use once in a while, but doesn't use necessarily every single day, and a subscription probably just doesn't fit very well. Where do you see utility apps going?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us it's a lot easier because we're just a small company. TLA Systems is just myself and my wife Saskia. We don't have any other employees who are relying on us to pay their wages. Like I assume Panic and companies like this are bigger companies. So I can do things that might not 100% make financial sense sometimes without worrying that I'm putting people's mortgages at risk. Yeah, with the App Store, I mean, the upgrade pricing is something, that developers constantly talk about. And I think that would be a good thing. I don't want to go down the subscription route. As you've said, it doesn't really seem to fit for most developers. And also, the thing with subscriptions is it's a bit like websites that people are happy to, I'm going to support like maybe, 1, 2, 3 websites that I really like and will subscribe. I'm, of course, a Club Mac Stories subscriber myself.
No, thank you.
But, once it's like every website is asking that, then it becomes harder because the amount of money that people want to spend is going to be the same. And I think the same is true for apps. If you have a handful of apps that you're happy to support that way, that's fine. But if you have 100 apps on your phone and they're all asking for a subscription, I just don't think it's going to work. And users seem to generally hate the idea of subscriptions. They want to own their apps in whatever way ownership is in the App Store world. And the thing that I fear, and I really don't want to see, is the App Store go in the direction of the music store with some kind of flat subscription that gets you access to everything, and then developers get paid by actual usage. I kind of think that might be inevitable, a sort of Netflix apps model. And I don't think we'll do any better out of that than the musicians are doing out of App Store, Music Store, and Spotify and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I share some of those concerns
Yeah.
as well. I mean, I think, how, James, would you say that your tip jar model has worked into your overall business strategy? I mean, do you know, for instance, like what percentage of your income is coming from tip jar versus just new users?
Yeah. No, I can see that broken down entirely. So with a tip jar, I was going to put in a tip jar, and I was also thinking about doing the alternate icon stuff. And a Mr. Mike Hurley and a Mr. CGP Grey convinced me that I should make the icons dependent on people having tipped. And because of that decision, I will thank them tomorrow when my iMac Pro arrives, because it's currently in Germany and should be here by tomorrow morning. And that's being paid for out of my tip jar. It's done very well. I mean, I think it's mostly people who kind of paid maybe 5-10 years ago and wanted to put a little bit more in the tip jar. And because there's no way of doing like a paid upgrade or something like that. Well, I mean, there are ways, but that all of them have their downsides, when you're trying to do things with bundles or just creating a completely new app on the store. There's no real good way of doing it. So this I'm kind of seeing as a voluntary way of that people who feel that, they're doing a good job have some tips. And it's not a vast amount of money in as a percentage, but it's been a nice little sum over the last 6 months. And, it's sort of iMac Pro sized sum. So I can't complain at all.
So James, before I ask you what's coming next, what do you think is coming next to PCalc and the App Store, I want to go back real quickly to a rumor that we've seen spread out on Twitter a few weeks ago about this report by Mark Gurman on Bloomberg that Apple is planning a shared framework of some kind to unify Mac and iOS apps. And I wonder, as someone who basically makes PCalc everywhere, do you still see the benefits of having standalone versions of PCalc for each platform, or do you believe that having the possible shared UI framework across the Mac and the iPhone and the iPad could be potentially a good idea going forward?
So I think there's two separate things here that you need to separate out. So there's the being able to use some of the same underlying code. PCalc already shares some chunks of code, mostly the lower level stuff, and things like in this most recent versions, the LCD display drawing code is now the same on all platforms, and the widgets and things, and the about screen code is the same everywhere. But it's a lot harder for things like, even just the buttons and things like that, or drawing stuff. And I've been hoping for the last 5 years that we would get some kind of unification in some way, so I could use the same code on both platforms. So like the iOS version's got features that the Mac version doesn't have, like say the layout editing. And it'd be great if I could just move all that code over and it would all just work. It doesn't mean that the Mac version would necessarily be the same binary or, a complete one-to-one port.
Mm-hmm.
But if I could concentrate more on the Mac specific side, I could concentrate more if all the core code was the same. I wouldn't be particularly happy if everything moved towards being one app and one sale across all the platforms, because that starts to, in a way, you could say that's the model between the iPhone and the iPad. You don't have to have one app that does both, but these days, really, you do. And that's just the direction the market's gone. So if it did come down to, we had one app that we sell everywhere, then I think that's going to encourage, or I think that's going to not encourage people to have more complicated apps on the Mac side of things. What I think you would see for that is like lots of games would do a very quick and easy port over to the Mac, and that's something. But I think if what this Project Marzipan or whatever it was is more about giving developers the ability to reuse code and to use the iOS frameworks are in some ways more modern than the Mac Cocoa frameworks. That would be great. It's the business side of things that is still unclear what's going on, but you know that's always the concern: is what is the business implication?
So aside from what may happen in terms of multiple platforms and this Project Marzipan, if we're gonna see something in WWDC or not, where do you think PCalc is going next, and how do you think it'll follow the evolution of the App Store? Let's say I don't want to ask you about the next 25 years, but maybe in the next 5 years, what do you think you're going to work on?
I think that's a good question. I think what's likely is if this Marzipan stuff is right, then I'll probably do a new Mac version, which is based upon that technology and bring over more of the features from the iOS side. I could see that being in the sort of, that will be my project for this summer. Beyond that, it's very hard to say. I mean, you know, phones are going to get faster and everything is going to keep going. I imagine in 5 years, it will be fairly recognizable. Question is whether Apple introduces something like AR glasses or some other product that we haven't yet seen. And I think there's a good likelihood of that based on the companies they've been buying and so on. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's some future for PCalc on a platform like that. Who knows? But yeah, it's I wouldn't have thought I'd be working on this app 25 years later. So I'm really bad, obviously, at predicting the future.
James, how is it that you get through working on this app year after year and not get bored?
Well, if you ever find out the answer to that one, please let me know.
All right, James. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thanks so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
And also, thanks everybody for listening in this week. Thanks to our sponsor, Spark by Riedel. And we'll be back next week with another episode of App Stories. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.